For 20 years, Hangar 9 sat sealed behind 3 layers of steel, a tomb inside Amelia Langford's private airfield. No engineer was allowed near the aircraft inside. Anyone who asked too many questions lost their job that week. But on the night the storm broke, Mason, a quiet single father on the overnight shift, heard a sound behind the forbidden door. He stepped through dust and silence, found a panel buried under 20 years of neglect, and woke an engine everyone believed dead. By the time Amelia arrived, the aircraft breathed again, dragging a secret to tear her family apart. If you truly want to know why Hangar 9 was buried alive for 20 years, stay until the final minute. The storm rolled over Langford Aeronautics a little after midnight, turning the runway lights into smeared streaks of gold against the rain. Wind tore at the warning signs bolted along the outer fence, rattling metal that had not been replaced in years. Most of the hangars on the property stood close together, sharing power lines and maintenance crews, but one building sat apart from the rest, set back behind its own fence and its own silence. Everyone on staff called it Hangar 9, though almost no one could say with certainty what was kept inside it. New employees learned the rule within their first week. Do not linger near Hangar 9. Do not ask why the door is sealed with steel plating instead of an ordinary roll gate. Do not approach after dark when the perimeter sensors switched to a higher alert setting that nobody bothered to explain. The building had its own camera loop, its own internal seal, and its own silence that pressed down harder than any spoken warning ever could. Mason Carter worked the overnight shift, the quiet hours when the airfield emptied out and only the maintenance crews remained. His job was simple on paper. Keep the backup generators running, patch the older wiring conduits, check the auxiliary fuel lines that fed the smaller aircraft bays. He was not the kind of man who went looking for trouble. He needed steady work and a paycheck that arrived on time, nothing more complicated than that. He rarely spoke about his life outside the airfield, and the little he did share stayed brief. He had taken the night shift because the daylight hours were already spoken for by responsibilities at home that came before anything else. He never elaborated, and nobody on the crew pushed him to. There was a quiet discipline in the way he carried himself, the kind that made people assume he simply preferred to be left alone. An older technician named Walt mentioned Hangar 9 to him during a slow shift, almost as a joke, the way veteran staff liked to scare newcomers. 20 years earlier, Walt said, an experimental aircraft had been towed into that hangar after some kind of accident, and it had never come out again. No paperwork mentioned its name. Every record that might have explained what happened had either been deleted or sealed somewhere far above the maintenance crew's reach. Amelia Langford, the current chief executive of the company, was the one who kept the lock in place. She had inherited the airfield and the title years earlier, and in all that time she had never once authorized anyone to open that door. Mason filed the story away the way he filed away most rumors, useful only as background noise to a job that mostly involved wires, fuel lines, and broken light fixtures. Then one night the pattern around Hangar 9 changed. Mason noticed the perimeter lighting near the building cycling on by itself, even though the section had supposedly been cut off from the main power grid years before. He checked his work order and found nothing scheduled for that zone. According to every system he could see, there was no equipment running inside, no staff present, no reason for anything electrical to be drawing current at all. The motion sensors along the inner fence line registered movement inside the hangar that same night, a brief flicker that should not have existed according to any official record. Mason paused at the edge of the restricted zone, rain soaking through his jacket, and listened. For a long moment there was nothing but wind and distant thunder. Then he heard it, a small sound from behind the sealed steel door, metal groaning as it expanded, followed by a thin electronic beep that sounded exactly like an instrument panel waking up. Mason had the hands of someone who had spent years around machines that demanded precision, hands that moved fast, clean, and without a single wasted motion. Anyone watching him strip a wire or reset a breaker would have guessed he understood far more than his job title suggested. His employment file described him as a facilities maintenance technician, nothing more, and that description suited him fine. The night supervisor assumed he was little more than a man who changed bulbs, patched cables, and kept the backup generators humming along. What nobody on the crew realized was that Mason once understood aircraft systems at a level few civilian technicians ever reached. He kept that history folded away, tucked behind a quiet manner that discouraged questions. Years earlier, he had worked alongside a small technical team on an experimental flight program, the kind of project that existed mostly off the books. A political dispute inside that program had cost him his position, and rather than fight to clear his name, he had simply chosen silence and walked away from the industry entirely. He never let that history surface at work, and he had no intention of starting now. Still, when he passed Hangar 9 on his rounds, certain details caught his attention in a way they would not have caught anyone else's. An auxiliary panel mounted outside the sealed door displayed an error code that did not belong to the airfield's current security system. It belonged to an older generation of experimental aircraft diagnostics, the kind Mason had not seen since he left that world behind. Curious despite himself, he pulled the camera logs for the hangar's exterior feed and found something strange. 12 minutes of footage disappeared from the recording every single night, vanishing cleanly with no error message and no gap reported anywhere in the system. He brought the discrepancy to his supervisor, expecting at most a shrug. Instead, the man's expression tightened, and he told Mason in a low voice never to log any irregularity connected to Hangar 9 in the official system, not ever. That response told Mason more than the missing footage itself. Someone was either slipping into that hangar undetected or quietly activating something inside it, and whoever controlled the official paperwork wanted no trace of either possibility recorded anywhere. He went digging through the maintenance archive on his own time and found an old wiring diagram of the airfield, one far older than anything currently in circulation. Buried in the diagram was a hidden power branch running straight into Hangar 9. According to every modern document, that branch should not have existed at all. Hangar 9 was supposedly abandoned, stripped of power, sealed, and forgotten. Yet someone had been quietly maintaining that hidden line for years, keeping it functional long after the building had officially gone dark. Mason traced the branch as far as the records allowed before the trail disappeared into redacted sections that predated his own employment by more than a decade. He returned to the area later that week under the excuse of checking a nearby junction box, and there, in the thin layer of dust coating the auxiliary panel, he found a single fresh handprint. It was too clean, too recent, pressed into dust that should have sat undisturbed for years. Mason stood there a long moment, rain dripping from the eaves above him, and understood that whatever secret lived behind that door, he was no longer the only person paying attention to it. Amelia Langford walked into the board meeting the next morning the way she walked into every room, composed, sharp, and entirely unwilling to let anything personal show on her face. The company stood on the edge of a major contract with a civilian defense partner, a deal large enough to revive an aerospace business that had spent years quietly losing ground. Everyone at the table understood how much was riding on the next several weeks, and everyone understood that Amelia intended to control every detail of it personally. Connor Langford, her uncle and a longtime member of the board, pushed once again for the company to sell off the older section of the airfield, Hangar 9 included, to a group of outside investors eager to redevelop the land. Amelia shut the idea down immediately, the same way she always did. Hangar 9, she told the table flatly, was not part of any transaction, now or ever. The board reminded her, not for the first time, that the building was nothing but an abandoned shed taking up valuable space. Her reaction to that remark was sharper than the topic seemed to warrant, and a few board members exchanged glances that Amelia pretended not to notice. Anyone who knew the company's history understood at least part of why. Her father, Joseph Langford, had died in an accident connected to the aircraft sealed inside that very hangar more than 20 years earlier. Amelia had been a child at the time, too young to remember most details, but she remembered her mother's voice clearly enough, telling her she must never, under any circumstance, open that door. Connor had repeated the same explanation to her for 2 decades. Her father, he said, had insisted on flying an aircraft everyone else considered unsafe, and the family had sealed the hangar afterward to protect the company's reputation from further scrutiny. Amelia had carried that story as fact for most of her life, yet one detail never stopped bothering her. Before he died, her father had left behind an unfinished message, just a handful of words scrawled in haste, warning her not to trust the official report. Gabriel Brooks, the company's former chief engineer, had once tried to speak with Amelia about what really happened that night, but Connor had intercepted him before the conversation could go anywhere. Amelia did not know this at the time. What she did know was that strange readings were now coming from a section of the property that was supposed to be completely dead, and she wanted answers before that information reached anyone outside the company. She ordered a full security review of the airfield's older sections, citing vague concerns about liability ahead of the upcoming contract signing. Jackson Reed, the head of airfield security, took charge of the review personally and issued a fresh round of warnings to every member of staff. It was through that review that Mason's name first crossed Amelia's desk, flagged as the technician who had logged an irregularity near Hangar 9 before being told to drop the matter entirely. That evening, Amelia stood at the window of her office, looking down at the hangar through sheets of rain. A figure stood near the sealed steel door below, motionless, head tilted slightly as if listening for something only he could hear. She recognized the silhouette from the security file open on her desk. Mason Carter was standing exactly where he had no business standing, and for reasons she could not yet name, the sight of him there unsettled her far more than it should have. The storm reached its peak just after 2 in the morning, knocking out a section of the airfield's primary power grid in a single violent surge. Backup generators kicked in unevenly across the property, leaving several zones dark while others flickered weakly back to life. Hangar 9, against every expectation, showed a faint light glowing from somewhere deep inside it, visible through the narrow gap beneath its sealed door. No system on record explained how a building with no active power source could be producing light of any kind. Mason was sent to check a junction box near the perimeter fence, while Jackson radioed a sharp reminder that nobody was authorized to cross the marked boundary line near the hangar under any circumstance. When Mason arrived at the junction box, he heard something else entirely, a high, thin hiss of pressure escaping from somewhere close by, the unmistakable sound of a hydraulic system engaging on its own. It was coming from inside Hangar 9, through a door that should have contained nothing but stale air and 20 years of dust. The steel door had not opened fully, but a narrow gap remained where the old seal had warped, just wide enough for Mason to see a dim blue glow reflecting off the dust-covered fuselage of something massive parked inside. He understood immediately that if the pressure system inside continued building without release, the result could be an electrical fire severe enough to spread toward the fuel storage area only a short distance away. This was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was a matter of basic safety, and safety was the one thing Mason never hesitated over. He broke the emergency seal and stepped through the gap, moving with the same calm precision he brought to every job, regardless of how strange the circumstances. Inside, an aircraft sat beneath decades of dust, its silver-gray frame unlike anything built for commercial use, sleek and strange in a way that spoke of purpose rather than passengers. Despite the years of neglect coating every surface, the core systems were clearly still receiving power from somewhere, humming faintly beneath the silence. A designation stenciled along the fuselage caught his eye immediately: Project Phoenix 9. The name struck something deep in his memory, a fragment from old files that had been quietly erased from circulation long before he ever left the industry behind. On the main console, a startup sequence was running through faulty steps, dangerously close to overheating a fuel pump that should never have been live in the first place. Mason climbed into the cockpit without hesitation, his hands moving across controls that felt oddly familiar despite the years, switching the system into a safer startup mode before anything could ignite. When his fingers brushed an auxiliary control lever, the main screen lit up with an old prompt demanding a technical authorization code, a relic from a security protocol decades out of date. Without quite understanding why, Mason entered a sequence he thought he had long since forgotten. The auxiliary engine shuddered to life beneath him. Lights flared on throughout the hangar's interior, illuminating dust and silence that had not seen light in 20 years. The aircraft, after 2 decades of forced sleep, was waking up. Amelia Jackson and a small team of security staff arrived at a run moments later, and Amelia froze at the sight of Mason seated inside the cockpit, certain in that instant that he had broken into the one place her family had sworn to protect. Her order came out cold and immediate. Mason was placed under restraint on the spot, while behind him, deep inside Hangar 9, the long-dead engine continued running, steady and sure. Mason was escorted to a small security office near the main terminal, where Jackson wanted to file a report for unauthorized entry and property damage before the night was even over. Amelia stood across from Mason, anger and confusion fighting for control of her expression in equal measure, because no one on her staff had ever managed to start that aircraft in 20 years, and now a maintenance technician had done it without trying. Mason explained calmly that he had entered only to prevent an electrical failure from spreading toward the fuel storage nearby, nothing more dramatic than that. Amelia did not believe him, certain he was inventing a convenient excuse to hide some other purpose entirely. Mason met her gaze steadily and asked a question of his own. Why exactly was an aircraft considered dead for 20 years, still receiving power from a hidden line nobody on the books could account for? The question landed harder than he expected, and for a moment Amelia had no answer ready at all. Jackson tried to cut the conversation short, pushing to hand Mason over to internal legal immediately rather than allow the exchange to continue. Mason offered one more detail, quiet but precise, the kind of detail that made Amelia's spine go cold. The aircraft systems had not failed because of any accident, he said. They had been locked down by an external forced shutdown command, the kind no ordinary technical fault would ever produce. Amelia asked how he could possibly know something like that. Mason did not reveal the full extent of his own past, only that the type of lockdown he had seen was not standard commercial design at all. It matched a data protection protocol used after experimental flight testing, something he recognized from a different chapter of his life that he chose not to explain further. Amelia ordered Mason suspended rather than terminated outright, because she needed to understand exactly what signal the aircraft had sent out before she decided anything else. Connor arrived shortly after, furious the moment he learned Hangar 9 had been opened. He demanded that Amelia destroy whatever data had just been activated inside that cockpit, his urgency striking her as far stronger than the situation seemed to warrant. For the first time in years, Amelia found herself questioning her uncle's instincts rather than trusting them outright. Mason was escorted off the property soon afterward, but before he left, he handed Amelia a folded scrap of paper with an error code he had seen flash across the cockpit display. That code, he told her quietly, was not an engine fault at all. It was the signature of an emergency recording system, one that had never been allowed to finish playing. Amelia stood alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the handwritten code under the lamplight, and for the first time in 20 years she allowed herself to wonder whether her father had truly died because of his own mistake, or because someone else had made very certain that he would. Rain kept falling against the office windows while Amelia sat with that scrap of paper, turning the small folded square over in her hands as though it might somehow reveal more if she looked at it long enough. She thought back to every story Connor had ever told her about her father, every detail repeated so many times over the years that she had stopped questioning any of it. Now each memory felt different, edged with a doubt she had never allowed herself to feel before that night. She thought, too, about Mason, a man she had ordered restrained within minutes of meeting him, yet the only person who had managed to wake a machine her own engineers had abandoned as hopeless. There was something unsettling about how calmly he had spoken to her, no fear in his voice despite being surrounded by security and an angry chief executive. Whatever his history truly was, he had not behaved like a man caught doing something wrong. He had behaved like a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Amelia spent the following days quietly searching through the company's oldest archives, the records nobody had touched in decades, stored in a basement room that smelled of mildew and forgotten paper. She found the original file on Project Phoenix 9, and almost immediately noticed how heavily it had been altered after the accident that ended her father's life. An early draft listed Gabriel Brooks as chief engineer on the project, yet his name had been quietly stripped from every later version of the same file. She tracked Gabriel down, living a quiet life in a small town several hours from the airfield, long retired from aviation and seemingly content to stay that way. He refused to discuss the past at first, reminding her that he had signed a confidentiality agreement years earlier that still technically bound him. When Amelia mentioned that someone had managed to start the aircraft inside Hangar 9, something shifted instantly behind Gabriel's eyes, a flicker of long-buried alarm breaking through his careful composure. Gabriel finally admitted that Phoenix 9 had never been a failure at all. It was the first experimental aircraft built with a self-stabilizing system capable of saving a pilot during a total loss of control, a breakthrough that could have reshaped flight safety standards across the entire industry. Joseph Langford, Amelia's father, had refused to let that technology be weaponized or sold to outside interests who wanted to turn it into a tool for remote control rather than rescue. A faction inside the board at the time had wanted to sell the underlying data to a buyer with far less honorable intentions, and Joseph had fought against the sale at every turn. On the night of the accident, Gabriel explained, Joseph had planned to fly the aircraft out of the airfield entirely, intending to hand the technical data directly to federal investigators before anyone could stop him. The aircraft never crashed that night, despite what every official record claimed. It returned safely to Hangar 9 under its own power. Joseph did not die during that flight at all. He died sometime afterward, inside the technical wing of the airfield, in what the official report later described only as an accident. Amelia sat in stunned silence as Gabriel spoke, though he was careful to admit he had no complete proof, only fragments and suspicion that had haunted him for 20 years without ever finding solid ground. He believed the proof, if it still existed anywhere, would be locked inside Phoenix 9's emergency recorder. The problem, Gabriel explained, was that the recorder would only unlock once the aircraft completed a genuine, full startup sequence, something nobody had managed in 2 decades. Amelia realized almost immediately that Mason might be the only person left alive capable of doing exactly that. Gabriel's expression turned grim as he offered one final warning before she left. If Connor ever learned that Amelia was digging through this particular piece of the past, he would either seal Hangar 9 forever or find a way to destroy the aircraft completely before anyone could prove otherwise. Amelia drove back toward the airfield with Gabriel's warning sitting heavily in her chest, the rain on the windshield doing little to clear her thoughts. She kept returning to the same unfinished message her father had left behind so many years earlier, the warning never to trust the official report, and wondered now whether he had known exactly what was coming, even if he hadn't known precisely how it would end. For the first time in 2 decades, that warning no longer felt like the confusion of a frightened child's memory. It felt like the truth he had tried to leave her in the only way he still could. Amelia drove to Mason's apartment herself rather than send anyone else to deliver the message, a decision that surprised even her own staff. The apartment was small and orderly, everything in its place, and near the door hung a single child-sized jacket, a quiet detail that explained without words why he guarded his private life so carefully. Amelia noticed it, understood enough not to ask, and returned her attention to the reason she had come. For the first time since they had met, she set aside the tone of a chief executive giving orders and spoke instead like someone who simply needed the truth. She asked Mason to come back to Hangar 9 and help her open the aircraft's emergency recorder, the one piece of evidence that might finally explain what had really happened to her father. Mason hesitated, telling her plainly that secrets like this one had a habit of destroying innocent people long before they ever touched the guilty. Amelia admitted something she had never said aloud to anyone. She had spent 20 years living inside a story written entirely by someone else, and she needed to know, once and for all, whether her father had been reckless or betrayed. Mason asked her directly whether she would have the courage to make the truth public if it proved her own family had orchestrated a cover-up. Amelia went quiet for a long moment before answering. If her father had been betrayed, she said, she would not let his name remain buried under a false report for one more day. Mason agreed, but only under conditions of his own choosing. No security team, meaning Jackson, stayed out of it entirely. No Connor anywhere near the hangar. No data deleted under any circumstance, and every step of process documented as it happened. Amelia accepted every condition without argument. He told her one more piece of his own history before they left, something he had never shared with anyone at the airfield. Years earlier, he had worked as a young technician on a separate flight stability program, one built on similar underlying architecture to Phoenix 9, though he had never worked on this exact aircraft itself. A scandal within that earlier program had ended with junior staff like him absorbing the blame meant for people far more powerful than they were. That night, Mason returned to the airfield once more, walking through the rain not as a technician people overlooked without a second thought, but as the one person left who might be able to wake a machine the world had buried alive 20 years earlier. Before they left the apartment, Amelia lingered for a moment near the doorway, glancing once more at the small jacket hanging there, then deliberately looking away, understanding without needing an explanation that some things in a person's life were simply not hers to ask about. She found herself oddly grateful that Mason had let her see even that much, a small, ordinary detail in a night otherwise consumed by 20 years of buried secrets and corporate lies. Mason locked the apartment behind them, checked the lock twice out of habit, and walked beside Amelia toward her car without another word about what waited at the end of the night. Neither of them spoke much on the drive back to the airfield. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and somewhere beneath the silence between them, an unspoken understanding had already formed. Whatever truth was waiting inside Hangar 9, they would face it together, on Mason's terms, with nothing hidden between them this time. Amelia, Mason, and Gabriel slipped into Hangar 9 together under cover of the late hour, careful to avoid the security rotation Jackson still controlled. The space inside looked like a museum nobody had bothered to curate, thick dust over every surface, scattered tools left exactly where someone had dropped them decades earlier, scorched blueprints pinned to a wall that had clearly survived some kind of fire. Cold light from a single overhead fixture spilled across the fuselage of the aircraft, giving it an almost ghostly presence in the silence. Mason worked through each system methodically, checking the power core, the hydraulic lines, what little fuel remained, the onboard flight computer, and finally the data recorder itself. Gabriel's hands trembled slightly as he looked around the space that had once ended both his career and his reputation in a single night. Amelia stood in front of the aircraft and felt something shift inside her. A quiet realization that this machine was not the monster that had killed her father after all. It was the last witness still capable of telling the truth. Mason noticed almost immediately that someone had tried to remove the emergency recorder before, the housing scratched and dented in a way that suggested force rather than careful disassembly. Whoever had tried clearly hadn't succeeded, which meant somebody at some point had wanted this particular piece of evidence gone for good. He began the safe startup sequence, then asked Amelia to enter a Langford family authorization code she had never once needed to use in her entire life. The screen requested voice confirmation from a direct air before it would proceed any further. Amelia spoke her own name into the small microphone built into the console, her voice steadier than she felt. The system recognized her instantly as Joseph Langford's daughter, and a section of the recorder's housing released with a soft mechanical click. Inside, a section of locked memory finally opened after 20 years of silence. A distorted voice recording crackled through the cockpit speakers, faint and worn by time but unmistakably her father's voice. He said that if anyone was hearing this recording, it meant he had failed to stop something in time. Phoenix 9 had never malfunctioned, he continued, his voice growing firmer despite the static. Someone had deliberately installed an unauthorized remote override into the system, a backdoor nobody on the engineering team had approved or even known about. He began naming the person responsible, his voice catching on two initials before the recording distorted into static, swallowing the rest of the name entirely. Amelia immediately thought of her uncle, the only person in her life whose name began with those same letters. Before anyone could process the weight of what they had just heard, the hangar's overhead lighting shifted to a harsh red warning glow. Jackson and a handful of Connor's men had already surrounded the building outside. Connor himself stepped through the door moments later, calm in a way that felt far more dangerous than shouting ever could. He told Amelia plainly that she had no idea what she had just opened, his composure cracking only slightly at the edges. Mason stayed quiet, watching the man closely, and realized Connor was stalling deliberately, buying time for some central system somewhere to finish executing a full data wipe. Connor gave the order to cut power to the entire hangar and pull Mason out of the cockpit by force if necessary. Mason, moving fast, had already copied a portion of the recovered data onto a small backup drive tucked inside his jacket before anyone reached him. The lights died around them, plunging the hangar into near-total darkness, broken only by the faint emergency glow still pulsing from the aircraft's instrument panel, stubborn and unwilling to go out completely. Connor abandoned any pretense of being the protective uncle who had raised Amelia after her father's death. He told her bluntly that Joseph had been dangerously idealistic, a man whose principles had nearly destroyed the company he was supposed to be running. Phoenix 9, Connor explained, represented technology worth more money than Amelia could easily imagine, while her father had been determined to hand the entire breakthrough over to federal investigators rather than let the company profit from it. He admitted, almost casually, that he had not personally killed Joseph, but that he had quietly arranged the circumstances that allowed the so-called accident inside the technical wing to happen exactly when it did. He ordered his men to hold Amelia, Mason, and Gabriel inside the hangar until the central system finished wiping every trace of the data they had just uncovered. Mason stayed calm, watching Connor closely, certain the man was stretching the confrontation out only to buy the time his system still needed. Amelia felt something break inside her chest, not from fear but from grief, realizing the uncle who had raised her for 2 decades was the same man who had quietly poisoned every memory she carried of her father. Connor offered her a way out, almost gently, telling her she could keep her position as chief executive if she simply stayed silent, signed off on selling the old section of the airfield, and allowed Hangar 9 to be quietly demolished within the year. Amelia refused without a moment of hesitation. Jackson stood frozen near the doorway, clearly unsettled by watching Connor openly override the company's actual chief executive in front of witnesses. Mason used that brief hesitation to his advantage, quietly reactivating Phoenix 9's auxiliary power source while attention remained fixed on Connor. The aircraft's systems flickered back on and the recorder's display screen began projecting fragments of data directly onto the hangar wall, filling the dark space with light and evidence at the same time. Gabriel scrambled toward the projection and found the remaining portion of the recording still intact. In it, Joseph clearly stated Connor Langford's full name, along with several other board members who had conspired alongside him. The recording also revealed that Joseph had secretly embedded a complete backup of the stolen data deep inside the air core memory, a copy that could only be extracted once. Phoenix 9 reached a fully completed startup state, not the partial sequence they had managed so far. Connor's composure finally cracked at the sound of his own name echoing through the hangar. He shouted at his men to destroy the main control panel before the data could finish projecting onto the wall. Mason reacted instantly, slamming down the manual cockpit lock from inside, sealing himself in and buying precious extra seconds before anyone outside could force their way through. Mason turned to Amelia through the scratched canopy glass, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos building around them. To get the rest of the data, he told her, starting the engine alone would never be enough. They had to get Phoenix 9 completely out of Hangar 9, into open air, where the system could finally complete the sequence it had been denied for 20 long years. For a moment nobody moved, the only sound the low hum of the engine and rain hammering against the steel roof above them. Gabriel stood frozen near the projected light, watching the proof he had waited 20 years to see finally appear in front of witnesses who could no longer deny it. Amelia looked at Connor, the man who had raised her, comforted her, and quietly shaped every version of the truth she had ever known, and felt the last piece of her old life fall away completely. The plan was never to fly Phoenix 9 recklessly into a storm-filled sky. Mason explained quickly, shouting over the noise inside the cockpit, that the aircraft only needed to taxi onto the open runway long enough to link with the outdoor positioning system and finish unlocking the core data buried inside it. Amelia used her authority as chief executive to override the hangar doors from her handheld terminal, only to discover that Connor had already locked her out of the central control system entirely from his own office upstairs. Jackson stood frozen between two impossible choices, his loyalty to the board pulling one direction while his duty to the legitimate chief executive pulled the other. When Connor barked an order to physically restrain Amelia, something in Jackson finally snapped into place. He shoved past two of Connor's men and used his own security credentials to unlock the side access panel, giving Amelia the override she needed at last. Whatever loyalty he still owed Connor ended in that single decisive motion. Inside the cockpit, Mason brought the main engine up slowly, careful with temperature and pressure after 2 decades of complete inactivity, watching every gauge with the same discipline that had once defined his entire career. Gabriel called out instructions from the ground below, repeating warnings about overheating risk every few seconds, his voice tight with nerves he could no longer hide. Bit by bit, the massive hangar doors began grinding open, rain immediately lashing sideways across the dust, streaked fuselage as the storm poured in. Maintenance staff and night crew alike gathered at a distance, staring in disbelief as the legend buried for 20 years rolled slowly out into the open for the very first time anyone present had ever witnessed. Connor attempted one final desperate move, cutting power to the runway lighting grid in hopes of stranding the aircraft halfway out, but Mason had already switched Phoenix 9 over to its own internal power reserve, leaving Connor's interference meaningless. Amelia took the seat beside Mason, not to fly the aircraft herself, but to confirm her inherited access rights and witness firsthand whatever truth the system was finally ready to release. Mason kept the aircraft steady and controlled, guiding it only as far as the designated positioning marker on the runway, then allowing the startup sequence to climb at last to full completion after 20 years of being denied that final step. The recorder's display flared to life across the main screen, streaming the complete dataset outward, full technical logs, the original remote override command, and the digital authorization signature belonging unmistakably to Connor Langford, all transmitted directly to an independent server Amelia had quietly prepared days earlier specifically for this moment. As the engine settled into a steady, controlled hum, the Phoenix 9 project emblem appeared briefly on the screen, followed immediately by one final message addressed directly to Amelia from her father. The message was short. Joseph said he had never wanted his daughter to spend her life living in fear, and that if she was hearing these words now, she should choose the plain truth over any comfortable inherited lie. Amelia's composure finally broke, tears falling silently down her face even as she remained upright, steady, and very much in control of herself. Within minutes, federal investigators and local authorities arrived at the gates of the airfield, while inside the security office, Connor stood frozen, watching every screen around him display the very evidence he had spent 20 years trying to bury. News of what happened that night spread quickly through the aviation industry, shaking confidence in a company already under scrutiny ahead of its major contract announcement. The old board was investigated thoroughly, and Connor was arrested on charges connecting him to evidence tampering, records manipulation, and a conspiracy to destroy property tied directly to a federal investigation. Gabriel Brooks, after 20 years of carrying blame that was never truly his, was finally and publicly cleared of any wrongdoing connected to the original accident. Joseph Langford's reputation was restored within the company's own history, no longer remembered as the man whose recklessness caused a fatal accident, but honored instead as the engineer who tried to stop dangerous technology from falling into the wrong hands. Amelia held a brief and understated public statement rather than a large press event, announcing that Langford Aeronautics would reopen its internal investigation completely and convert Hangar 9 into a permanent technical memorial rather than tear it down. Mason avoided the cameras entirely, wanting nothing more than to return to the quiet, ordinary life he had built for himself before any of this began. Amelia personally offered him a leadership role overseeing the company's renewed flight safety research, though Mason did not accept the offer right away. He told her plainly that he had no interest in living through another chapter built on secrets the powerful use to bury people who had no voice to defend themselves. Amelia promised him that every future project under her leadership would operate with full transparency and independent oversight, free from the kind of board-level manipulation that had once cost her father his life. Mason eventually agreed to join as a technical advisor, not for the salary or the title, but because Phoenix 9 had proven something he believed deeply. A machine left for dead could still restore the honor of the person who built it, if someone brave enough finally chose to listen. That evening when Mason returned home, he set his new employee badge down on the small table by the door, beside a child's drawing left unfinished from earlier in the week. Nothing more needed to be said about that part of his life for the story to feel complete. Amelia, meanwhile, stood in front of Hangar 9 just as dawn broke over the airfield, watching as the very last lock was removed from the door for good. Inside, Phoenix 9 sat quiet under the early light, dust still clinging to its frame, yet no longer resembling the lifeless steel coffin everyone had assumed it to be for 20 long years. For 2 decades, people had treated that aircraft as a secret meant to stay buried forever. In truth, it had simply been waiting the entire time for someone brave enough to finally open the door and listen. Jackson kept his position at the airfield, though his role shifted considerably under the new leadership, his loyalty finally placed where it always should have been. Gabriel accepted a quiet consulting role of his own, helping restore the technical archives that had been altered and stripped clean over the years, glad simply to see his old work remembered honestly at last. Walt, the older technician who had first told Mason the rumor about Hangar 9, liked to remind anyone new on the night shift that some old stories were not exaggerated at all. If anything, he said, they had not told half of it. Some truths can be locked behind steel for 20 years, sealed, denied, and buried under official reports written by people with everything to hide. But a truth like that never truly dies, not as long as someone out there still has the courage to open the door and listen closely to what waits on the other side. Mason was never built like some impossible hero. He was simply a man with steady hands, quiet discipline, and the courage to act the moment it mattered most, regardless of who doubted him or underestimated what he carried inside. Amelia was never only a cold executive guarding a family fortune. She was a daughter brave enough to tear down a lie that had shaped her entire life, even when that lie came wrapped in the comfort of family loyalty. Hangar 9 stood for far more than one buried aircraft. It became a symbol of every secret families carry quietly across generations, every fear passed down like an inheritance nobody ever asked to receive, and every voice silenced simply because speaking up felt too dangerous at the time. Phoenix 9 was not brought back to life by fuel and electricity alone. It was brought back by truth, finally given the chance to speak after 20 long years of forced silence. If you found yourself holding your breath the moment Mason finally woke that engine, or felt your chest tighten the instant Amelia heard her father's voice again after all those years, or sat in stunned silence the moment Connor's mask finally slipped away completely, that feeling was the whole point of telling this story in the first place. Stories like this one exist to remind us that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one holding the key. Stay close for more stories about ordinary people the world overlooked, the ones who turned out to be holding the very key that changed everything.